Around the year 950, there emerged one of the most powerful countries in Eastern Europe, Rus. However, the origins of this Eastern powerhouse are uncertain. Though the Rus were literate, they did not start recording their own history until the 11th century. But it was between 930 and 950 that they became relevant enough for their superpower neighbors, the Abbasid Caliphate and Byzantine Empire, to describe them in better detail. Before then, no one can be certain as to what Rus really meant. What is certain, however, is that somewhere in Eastern Europe there existed a powerful king called Rus Khagan, who loosely commanded a warlike aristocracy of violent, riverbound merchants. The Kievan primary chronicle made an attempt at explaining the polity's early history. According to the chronicle, it was three Varangian brothers, Rurik, Saneas and Truvor, that established a multi-ethnic polity between Izborsk and Belauzera. This early Rus would later expand into the tributaries of the Khazar Khanate, taking the city of Kiev and making it the new capital. So it's settled. Or is it? The problem with the chronicle is that it was written around 1118, almost 300 years after the starting events. Appears to have had few original sources to rely on, appears heavily based on biblical lore, and doesn't mention historical facts evidenced by archaeology and actual contemporary records. Some of its statements can be verified by contemporary sources, which it was likely based on in part, in addition to oral tradition, and a sprinkling of bullcrap. Most prominently, it excludes Rus' involvement in Eastern affairs, with the Bulgars, the Khazars, and the Caliphate, and the importance of Eastern commerce. It doesn't at all describe the trade route going between Lake Ladoga and the Caspian Sea, favoring instead a much later route between the Varangians to the Greeks. And this is really where the interesting history lies, because a majority of sources speaking about the early Rus are Arabic ones discussing contacts in Khazaria. Most likely, this was due to the Khazars having long since been destroyed by 1118 by the Rus. The only memory they had of this forgotten nation was an enemy. The Arabs viewed the Rus entirely through a Turkic lens. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the writer of the most detailed account of the Rus, never traveled further than modern Kazan, which was far away from any territory ever part of the Rus. So it wasn't until around 930, when Arabic sources were the first to describe Kiev, Kuyaba, as a Rus city, that they were even understood to hold any territory. Before then, the Arabs knew next to nothing about their homeland, didn't care, and viewed them instead as a constant itinerant, closely tied to the Khazar Khanate. Of course, this view is highly flawed. They might have only encountered an upper class of traveling merchants and raiders, whose culture may not have been reflective of a settled majority in the homeland, and the groups of Rus described by the different authors may have been different samples from a wider group, which were all different. But these sources are what historians have to work with, if they want to assume anything about these early Rus. And because of this itinerant nature, it is frankly irrelevant to discuss the true ethnic origins of the early Rus. Their cultural customs appear similar to both Scandinavian, Finnic, and Slavic customs, but heavily influenced by Turkic, so much so that if it weren't for their physical descriptions as pale-skinned and blonde, they would have been seen as Turks, which some Arabs actually did. Basically, the Rus which the Arabs encountered adapted a new identity of their eastern travels, irrelevant to their origins, which they may have shedded when they came back home, wherever it was. Neither do the Arabs ever mention any names or language. They do invariably describe the Rus as being a part of and different from the Sakaliba, which historians agree was a general term for any fair-skinned northerners. Usually in terms of slaves, the Bulgar Khan was understood as a king of the Sakaliba because of the amount of white slaves he held, but there are also descriptions of Sakaliba merchants and such. Of course, attempts can be made at tracing the original territory of the Rus, what might have been their origins and their first capital. A few written sources provide a weak standing point, which can be corroborated by archaeology. But most central to this objective is the mysterious figure known as the Rus Khagan. The title of Khagan is originally Turkic, and everyone watching is no doubt familiar with the Mongol Khagans. But there were many Khaganates across the steppe and its history, including the Rus Khaganate, as it would seem. The fact that the Rus held the title of Khagan for their king indicates their strong, early connection to the Turkic culture. The first written source to describe a Rus Khagan is the Annales Bertiniani. In this Frankish record, it is mentioned how in the year 839, a Byzantine delegate arrived at the imperial court, together with diplomats known as Rus. They had been sent by a sovereign called the Chaganus, Khagan, and they traveled to the Franks in order to reach their homeland, as the original route was deemed unsafe. After further inquiries, the emperor discovered these Rus to be from the Jensuyoni, the tribe of the Swedes. What happened next is unknown. Several things can be discerned from this meeting, even though it is vague. Byzantium had diplomatic ties to a Khagan of the Rus. Next, the Rus were either Swedes, they were akin to Swedes, or a people of Swedish origin that were able to adapt the identity of Rus. Finally, these Rus wanted to reach their homeland via Germany, since the original route was so dangerous. Starting out with the diplomatic ties, it was common for the Rus in later years to attack Byzantium and then make a treaty with various diplomatic and trade concessions. The Life of St. George of Amestris mentions the Rus attacking the empire around the year 800, but this account was written almost 200 years later, and is mostly believed to be fiction. However, it is an interesting prospect that some early raid or interaction might have provoked this diplomatic concession. Some of the earliest Arabic sources also mention the Rus having trade contacts in Byzantium, probably not the city itself, possibly only Crimea. Then there's the matter of a Rus homeland. Scholars tend to place the Rus homeland either around Kiev, or around Lake Ilmen, or even in Sweden. It could very likely be all of these. Bin Haukala was one of the several Arabic sources that in the 10th century described the Rus as consisting of three kinds: the Kievans, the Salawiya, and the Arthania. It would be very convenient if these were the Kievans, obviously, then the Ilmenians, and finally the Scandinavians, but I digress. It's unlikely that the homeland of the diplomats sent by the Khagan was Kiev, because if they really wanted a safe travel back home, going through Byzantium via the Black Sea, up the Dnipro and into Kiev, it might be hard going through the horse nomads, but hardly compared to crossing the Mediterranean, Italy and Germany. More than likely, their destination was Ilmen or Scandinavia. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the homeland of all Rus was Ilmen or Scandinavia. It's unlikely that the Swedes meant that they were Rus, as in people from Ruden, since they called the king of Rus Khaganus. Some have interpreted Khaganus as the Latin transcription of Hakon, but considering the amount of sources referring to a Rus Khagan in Eastern Europe, it seems likelier that it was some sort of prince located in that region. And even if the homeland of the diplomats was in Scandinavia or Ilmen, it doesn't mean that the Khagan was located there. Maybe he was located in Kiev, hired the Swedes as Rus diplomats to Byzantium, and when they were done, they wanted to go home. So in the end, the answers are only more questions. If Ruden is to be excluded as the capital of the Rus Khagan, that leaves Kiev or Lake Ilmen, so let's take a look at the available evidence of either. Starting out with Kiev, archaeological findings point to the area having housed agricultural settlements since the 6th millennium BC, and by the time of the Rus Khaganate, it was already a prosperous settlement. From the previous centuries, archaeological findings include Roman and later Byzantine coins, indicating a trade connection. So when Ibn Khordadbeh wrote in the mid-9th century of the Rus, sailing to Byzantium and paying tithe there, maybe it was a Rus centered around Kiev. The city was, after all, the capital of the Rus from at least the mid-10th century onwards. Maybe it never became the capital, but was always the capital. According to the primary chronicle, the city paid tribute to the Khazars, so maybe its close connection and status as a tributary allowed its prince to assume the title of Khagan. The issue with the early Kiev connection is that the Rus primarily described by the Arabs were merchants traveling by boat through Bulgar down the Volga, indicating that they came from the northwest, not from Kiev, which would have been quite a detour, which makes the Ilmen theory likelier, but it doesn't exclude the idea of some sort of state or tribal union existing in Kiev, tributary to the Khazars and trading with Byzantium. If Kiev wanted to trade with the Khazars and Caliphate, they would have gone into the Black Sea, then the Sea of Azov and up the Don to the city of Iril. However, it would then make no sense for them to go north, up the Volga into Bulgar, which is where Ibn Fadlan met the Rus he so famously described. But it doesn't omit the existence of Kievan traders in the Caspian, since the Arabs do mention Salawiya merchants present in Itil. Maybe these were Kievans. And the Rus were described as different kinds, but it does at least prove that Rus weren't exclusively from Kiev, and that at least a large part probably came from the northwest. There are several clues pointing to Lake Ilmen as being the first stronghold of the Rus Khagan. It is nowadays the location of Novgorod, once a medieval merchant republic, though the primary chronicle described Novgorod as an ancient city where Rurik first began his reign, The city wasn't actually founded until the late 10th century, which is evidenced by the name, literally meaning new town. The original settlement was located 2 kilometers away. Its original Slavic name is unknown, maybe it was called Novgorod by its first settlers, but is nowadays called Garadiche. In Nordic sources it appears to have been called Holmgard, island compound. If later sources describing the power of Kiev are to be used as evidence for the early importance of the city, then the same might be done for Lake Ilmen. The location was made the capital seat of Rus in 1010, after the denizens made complaints of the city losing its influence. Nordic sources appear to have called it the capital of Garthariki, their name for Rus. Throughout the 11th century it was a powerful rival of Kiev, eventually supplanting it and becoming an independent republic. This might attest to it being a historical powerhouse. However, any sort of early polity centered around Lake Ilmen would not have been entirely Slavic, unlike Kiev, in which Scandinavian influence only started appearing around the 10th century. Only Lake Ilmen was Slavic, whereas the environs were densely settled by Finnic tribes like the Chudes, Kriviks, Vepsians, etc. Scandinavian influence was also strong in settlements like Alaborg and Aldeguborg, located on Lake Ladoga, as well as settlements located on the Volga route, likely a part of the Ilmen polity. Garadiche appears to have been constructed in the 8th century. Judging by findings of arrowheads, bread ovens, and pottery, most of its population was Slavic. However, Scandinavian findings, including items of colthood, are abundant. There are findings of Arabic silver coins, indicating that the town was part of the eastern trade route. Most intriguing to our discussion is the findings of a copper Byzantine coin of Emperor Theotilos, reigning between 829 to 842. Then there is the finding of a Byzantine seal dating to the early 9th century, belonging to Domestikos Leon. Both of these findings indicate a strong diplomatic connection to Byzantium, and their dating corresponds to the appearance of the Rus at the Frankish court. There is also an Arabic source, written by Ibn Rushd around the year 900, describing where the Rus live. It has often been interpreted as Lake Ilmen. The excerpt goes as follows. As for the Rusia, they live on a peninsula surrounded by a lake. It takes a 3 days journey to cross the island, which is covered with forests and thickets. It is plague-stricken, and the soil is so damp that it moves underneath people's feet. However, Ibn Rushd's account should not be taken as gospel. Neither he nor any Arab writer appears to have entered the Rus homeland, and they had a poor geographic understanding of the region, nor is the account especially consistent. Ibn Rushd describes the Rus as possessing several urban centers, but also that they do not have any houses or land, or villages or cultivated fields. Maybe this means that the Rus were an upper class that demanded tribute from a settled populace, or simply that the Arabs only ever met the itinerant Rus, traveling through Bulgar and Khazaria. Either way, judging by the Oriental silver findings, the Byzantine copper coin and the later political authority of Lake Ilmen, it seems highly possible that it was the first capital of the Khagan Rus. It was connected both to the Byzantines and Arabs, both of whom described this Rus Khagan. It all makes a lot of sense, but shouldn't be taken as a fact, because only the dead can know for certain, and last time I checked, they weren't very talkative. Aside from its interest in trade, the Khaganate appears to have exerted other influence abroad. There is the prospect of them attacking Muslim Al-Andalus in southern Spain in 844. Local sources describe the naval attack as committed by Majus, a general term for pagans, which some Arab authors interpreted as being the Rus specifically. If it actually were the Rus, or maybe Norwegians or Danes, a people unknown to the Muslims, is unknown. It is interesting regardless. Aside from the probably fictitious Rus attack on Paphlagonia, early contact between Rus and Byzantium appears to have been peaceful. This was possibly facilitated by the close relation between Byzantium and Khazaria. Emperor Constantine V married the Khagan's daughter in 732, and their son was called the Khazar. Another fruit of their mutual interests was the construction of a fort at Sarkel on the Lower Don in the 830s. However, in 860, the Rus visited Byzantium itself for a different type of trade. Patriarch Photius compared the attack to a thunderbolt. Though unable to conquer the city itself, the 200 vessels were able to pillage the suburbs, setting fire to the homes and murdering its residents. Monasteries were ransacked and the priests tortured. The emperor and his navy were currently absent on different affairs, and the Rus finally departed when they had their content. Interestingly, Photius described them as coming from the farthest north, sundered off from us by so many lands and kingdoms, by navigable rivers and harbourless seas. He called them a fierce and barbarous Scythian tribe, an obscure nation, nomadic, leaderless. Of course, this seems to have been nothing more than a cope. Some sort of state organization must have been required to amass, execute, and successfully complete something as ambitious as an attack on the world's greatest city. Photios later admitted how the Rus had subjugated their neighboring tribes before making the attack, indicating some form of state growth and centralization. He described them as being ruled by a leader and a group of elders. Shortly after the raid, in 861, Photios delivered a missionary to the Khazars. His intention seems to have been to reach the Rus. It was a long-standing Byzantine tradition to deal with their enemies by converting and allying them. By 867, the mission had been a success. Photios reported how the Rus now had a bishop and a pastor among them, and even that they had converted and become allies of Byzantium. But it doesn't seem like the conversion was lasting. If it even happened in the first place, it might have been the patriarch bullshitting. There is no archaeological evidence for it. The Rus maintained their paganism until Vladimir the Great, and this initial attempt may have provoked an uproar. Around 870, the city of Aldegibor was burned down. Around the same time, there was also a fire at the fortified settlement of Holmgard. The simultaneous fires at the power bases of the Rus indicates not an accident, but some deliberate form of upheaval. After Aldegibor was burned down, the original inhabitants rebuilt the city, but a few years later, a stone fort and a mansion were constructed, indicating a shift in the power dynamic. Moving away from the violence, it seems as though early Rus had trade contacts not only to the south and the east, but the west as well. In the early 9th century, a powerful Slavic state emerged in Central Europe, called Great Moravia. It converted to Christianity very early and was the founder of a Slavic liturgical and written tradition. When the state was toppled, the theologians moved on to Bulgaria, and from there had influence in the Christianity of Kiev. But I digress. The Moravians produced a sort of pendant which has been found in Rus. It appears as though there was a trade network connecting North Russia, Scandinavia, and Moravia. Church records also make mention of a market in modern Austria called Rutsamarsa, where goods were delivered by the Rugis, recognized by historians as the Rus. The most important import from Moravia would have been salt, in return for craft goods, wax, silver, and amber. Moravia also housed a huge slave market, which was described and frequented by Jewish merchants from the Arab Caliphate. In the title of the video, I refer to the early Rus as Eastern Vikings, and this has no doubt already caused considerable uproar. People saying the Rus weren't Scandinavian, they weren't criminals, Viking it doesn't exist or whatever. And while the title is partly clickbait to attract a wide audience interested in Vikings, and also to provoke the midwits to comment and boost the algorithm, the word Viking is largely misunderstood. Raiding and pillaging wasn't seen as criminal, but as an honorable military activity. The act of going out and gathering treasure to share with your retinue, family and friends was the highest honor. Neither were the Vikings always raiders. They could go on regular military campaigns, but also as traders. Trade and piracy were apple and pie up until the 18th century, and violence was often used to enforce commerce as late as the Opium War. And I guess it is still done today, just a bit more subtly. Not really. We're not gonna talk about it. Neither was Viking an ethnic term. Saxon poetry described Israelite Vikings. The Norse sagas describe Estonian and Spanish Vikings. It simply meant a sea raider, and though the Vikings as we understand them were predominantly Scandinavian, they could also bring other ethnicities with them, like Western Slavs, Balts, Finns, and people of each tribe were often enough of mixed heritage. Knut the Great, for example, seems to have had a Polish mother. So yeah, referring to the early Rus as Eastern Vikings really makes a lot of sense. They were violent raiders and merchants, operating out of boats along the eastern riverways, whose ethnic backgrounds were irrelevant to the identity they adapted in the east, which the next part of the video will focus on, and the possible culture of the Rus Khaganate. Arabic sources provide the most colorful descriptions of the early Rus, but as I mentioned in the beginning, these sources are flawed in that they describe only itinerant Rus in Khazaria and Bulgar. To them, these travelers were the only Rus, or at least the only relevant ones. Thus, some historians believe that the identity of Rus early on was not an ethnicity, but rather an upper class of traveling warrior merchants that adapted a shared identity on their travels abroad. In the 10th century, Rus would change meaning into the ruling aristocracy of Eastern Europe, and eventually become a national identity. Such a development of identity is not unheard of in history. America derives from the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, and came to mean the entirety of the New World. Initially, American referred to American natives, Indians, but in the late 18th century it came to mean the denizens of the United States, which then only encompassed the east coast of North America. Anyone who was born and lived in the entirety of the New World had as much claim to the title of American, but now it meant something completely different. Same as the word Creole, it originally meant white Europeans born in the New World, or even ships built in the colonies. But now it means New World cultures of mixed African and European heritage. Identity takes different shapes and changes meaning over time. Our idea of a national belonging may not have been applicable at all to a barely literate people living in the 9th century, who we know next to nothing about. In a previous video I've discussed the most possible theories as to the origin of the word Rus. Some say it stems from Ruden in Sweden, others from the Roxolani, and it goes on and on. Personally, I'm inclined to a lesser-known Turkic theory. Rus would derive from the Old Turkic uros, meaning to fight oneself. It is possibly related to the Chuvash, Viraj, and the Hungarian oros, both meaning Russian. The Turks referring to the Rus as a people fighting among themselves makes a lot of sense, because Arab writers are forthcoming in describing their violent and treacherous society. Ibn Rushd wrote the following: "None of them answers the call of nature, except when he is followed by 3 of his kinsmen, who watch over him. Each of them carries his sword, because security is scarce and betrayal is common among them. And when a man has possessions, his brother and an accompanying kinsman may fall on him and plunder his belongings." It also makes sense that the Arabs and Byzantines adapted this word, since their primary early interactions with the Rus were through the Khazars. Since the Rus already admired the Turks enough to adapt their title of Khagan, clothes, tattoos, various cultural customs, and serve in their military, using their name for them makes a lot of sense, especially if they were a bunch of scattered traders at first, who eventually adapted this shared, common identity. Initially, I was going to include a lengthy bit on the Rus in Arabic sources, describing their culture, fashion, and so on. But it became so lengthy and separate enough from this script to warrant its own video, which will come out next month. Instead, let's try to make sense of this scattered history and assemble some form of timeline. It is unknown when or how the Rus Khaganate exactly came to be. The title of Khagan could simply not be adapted. It was largely a ceremonial and religious position, granted either by marriage, vassalage, or the conquest of a nomadic tribe. The Rus appear to have gained this title through their close connection to the Khazar Khanate. It is likewise uncertain where the Khan was located. It has been proposed that he was nomadic, traveling by boat along the rivers, like his itinerant merchants. Maybe he was based in Kiev, which seems to have been a Khazar tributary, would later become the capital of the Rus, and whose later princes did bear the title of Khagan. A lot of evidence points to the fortress at Lake Ilmen, Holmgard, as being a local power base, with connections as far as Byzantium. Judging by Ilmen's later political authority, it may very well have been the first true capital of the Rus, and maybe the seat of the Khagan. In the early 800s, the Khagan began spreading his influence, having diplomatic and trade contacts with Byzantium and Khazaria. His warriors would frequently serve the Khazars as mercenaries, and it's likely that the Khazars introduced him to the Byzantines. In the mid-800s, a centralization process occurred. According to Patriarch Photios, neighboring tribes were subjugated and a government established, headed by a ruler and a council of elders. This government was powerful enough to amass a fleet of 200 ships and lead an assault on Constantinople itself. A few years after the attack, the Byzantines had re-established diplomatic contact and set up a bishop in Rus. They claimed to have converted them, but all evidence points to the contrary. In addition, around the year 870, the city of Aldeigjuborg burned down, and Holmgard fell victim to a fire. Aldeigjuborg was rebuilt by the previous inhabitants, but a large mansion was constructed, and a Scandinavian stone fortress. These events correspond to the political upheaval described in the primary Chronicle around the same time. It is around 930 that the Arabs described Kiev as the seat of one of the Rus kings. They described the Rus as consisting of 3 kinds. Maybe they were different, semi- or fully independent principalities at this point. Either way, 930 can be seen as the latest starting point of the Kievan Rus. But how exactly did the power dynamic shift from Lake Ilmen to Kiev? Was there a political union? A conquest? The rise of Kiev appears to have coincided with the encroachment of the Pechenegs. The primary chronicle dates their first attack to 915. Perhaps the different principalities of Rus banded together under the Kievan prince for mutual protection against this nomadic threat to their lucrative trade route. What happened exactly is uncertain, except that the history of the Rus in the 10th century onwards is much more vivid and will be discussed in a future episode. If you enjoy the content I produce, please consider supporting me monetarily by becoming a channel member or patron over on Patreon. You'll find the necessary links in the description box below, in addition to the sources used for writing the video script.